Hello again. The second aspect, or the second distinctive that we need to understand about Israelite culture is the concept of family and community. I'm going to write these up so that you commit them to mind. These two concepts are the central concepts of everything that is in Tanakh. You need to understand that all the law is based in the concepts of family, and family as a subset of the concept of community. You need to realize that when Abraham was called to come and follow God, when he was called out of Ur of the Chaldeans and then into a land which the Lord would show him, what he was promised was essentially family and community. Your descendants will be as numerous as the sands on the seashore. Now, I believe that one of the big things about Abraham was the realities of the promise of family and community. Now, of course, the reality for Abraham is that he never got to see the fulfillment of that prophecy. He never got to see the fulfillment of what God had promised him in that beginning point in Genesis. And so we need to understand that as a reality for Abraham, that he never got to see it. He only had his own son, Isaac. And in fact, Isaac only got to see these two sons, Jacob and Esau. But the process of development into a nation was based in the concept of family. Now, unless one looks at the commands in terms of family, one misses the point. Of course, the reality for us today, living in the West, is that we don't live within the concept of family. We live within the concept of the individual. And so effectively, when we talk about rules, we talk about how the rules affect me. We talk about what I'm going to do with my life, about how independent I am. But of course, that's completely different to tribal thinking. Because in tribal thinking, the tribe isn't measured by its individuals, but rather by its collective, by how it works together, by how it lives together, by how it connects together. Each person has got their own particular skill which they contribute towards the whole. And the whole is greater than the sum of its individual parts. That's the same thing that you need to understand if you're reading Tanakh. So when the Bible tells you in the Ten Commandments, do not commit adultery, he's not saying to every man who's married, say, don't commit adultery. It's rather making a comment about family and about community. What it's actually saying is, don't commit adultery, not because adultery is wrong, but because adultery will undermine family. And if you undermine the family, in the end, you undermine your community. And that's the same for all the commands that you see within the Tanakh. So if you look within Torah, within Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and so on, especially books like Leviticus, which are hard to read, one of the biggest questions you've got to ask yourself is, how does this command deal with the concept of family or community? Because that's what they were there for. They were there to help regulate that community. They were there to help connect that community to each other. They were there to help build the strong bonds between people so that once those bonds were there, that nothing would be able to break them. Not exile, not suffering, not persecution, that none of those things would be there. That in fact people would continue to live even in that situation because of the strength of family. One of the aspects of this was the feasts. And of course, in ancient culture, just like today, I suppose, if you go into the Pacific culture, you realize that there's many times when, in fact, things surrounded by the concept of the feast, of coming together and bringing food. And of course, in a farming environment, food was the central point. It's what you did all day. You left home early in the morning and you went and you plowed the fields, or you picked the olives, or you did whatever you need to, and you brought the fruit of your labor home. And so, of course, the feast was a celebration of God's blessing. But in Israelite culture, the feast wasn't only a celebration of God's blessing. It was also an opportunity for people to come together as families. Now, you need to see that even in things like Passover, one of the great festivals of the Israelite culture, celebrating or remembering God's giving them of life in the 10th plague in Egypt. One of the things we have to remember about that is that it was done as a whole family. You know, in many cultures, especially in tribal cultures, often the men would eat by themselves and the women eat by themselves, and potentially the children would eat by themselves, sometimes with the mothers. But in Jewish culture, the whole family would eat together. They would eat together. And what that meant was that the children immediately were drawn into the mysteries of the feast, were drawn into the rituals of the faith. They weren't separated, they weren't out there, they were rather brought in here as part of the process of God, as part of the reality of living together. And so when we see that, we need to understand that it was a cohesive group. It was a group that found its connection with each other. It's very interesting if you look at the dispersion of the Jews. So especially through the different persecutions that have happened over the years, 586 and then through into 70 AD, in 165, and so on, as you go through the various dispersions of the Jews, wherever they've ended up, whether it be in Europe or in the Far East or Africa, all the Jews have always become, again, small communities. And I believe the reason for that is because that was one of their particular distinctives, is that they came together and they were able to be bound together by the belief that their faith was surrounded by the concept of family and community. So when you read Tanakh, always ask yourself, how is this connected to family and community? How is this helping to build this? Because that's what the writers back in exile in 586 and so on, when they were writing for the next 60 years, when they were writing the Bible, when they were writing Tanakh, what they were doing was actually saying, how are we going to help our people remain Jewish in a foreign land? How are we going to keep them connected to the faith in this land with polytheism, with other things? And we see the reality of that in books like Daniel. You may remember the book of Daniel, that in the book of Daniel, Daniel and his friends were brought into Nebuchadnezzar's court, and they were given all the lavish foods. And even though it's not said, I suspect that there may have been some pork involved. And so what happened is that they were offered all this lavish food. And Daniel looks at Nebuchadnezzar and says, listen, just give us water and vegetables. And I guarantee you we'll actually thrive on those better than some of your other courtiers are doing on the meat that they're eating. And of course, for me, that story is there in order to teach us a little bit about the Israelite distinctiveness. And so the distinctiveness which was there was connected to the concept of God, was connected to how we understand community and family. The way in which those early writers of Tanakh was on about was to say that how do we maintain people's connection to faith? Is we maintain it by maintaining family, and we find family as the subset of community. Now, we also need to realize that anybody that stands also falls, and the understanding of that is very clearly in the concept of sin. You know, for us, it's about the sins I commit. But if you look at Tanakh, you realize that, in fact, the sins that I commit are secondary to the sins, as those sins affect the whole community. And so, therefore, repentance and forgiveness is not something that's an individual thing as much as it is a corporate thing, a community thing. And therefore, repentance and those kinds of things need to be done in that corporate space as well. Until we understand the concepts of family and community, I don't think we'll ever really understand the concept of church. Because the concept of church in the New Testament is based on this Israelite distinctive of family and community in the Tanakh.